The paradox of the unexpected hanging. The unexpected hanging paradox is a puzzle that centers around prediction, knowledge, and expectations. It explores the relationship between certainty and surprise, particularly in how we think about events that are supposed to happen in the future. The paradox goes like this. A judge tells a condemned prisoner that they will be hanged at noon on one weekday in the following week, but with a twist. The hanging will be a surprise. The prisoner will not know the day of the hanging until the executioner comes to take them. The judge also stipulates that the hanging cannot occur on the last day of the week, Friday, because by Thursday the prisoner will know the hanging is coming, and thus it would not be a surprise. At first glance, this seems like an ordinary scenario. However, the prisoner, trying to reason logically about the situation, concludes that the hanging cannot happen on Friday. If the prisoner survives until Thursday, they will know that the hanging must occur on Friday, which contradicts the judge's condition that it must be a surprise. By this reasoning, the prisoner also concludes that the hanging cannot happen on Thursday either, because if they survive until Wednesday, Thursday would be the last possible day, and they would know it's coming. This reasoning continues, eliminating all the days of the week. However, the paradox occurs when the prisoner is unexpectedly hanged on Wednesday. According to their reasoning, the hanging was impossible, but when it happens, it still comes as a surprise. The paradox explained. The paradox is built around the notion of a surprise event. The prisoner uses reasoning to eliminate each day of the week, concluding that the hanging cannot occur on any of the weekdays. But by doing so, they set themselves up for the very surprise that the judge had promised. The core issue of the paradox is how prediction and reasoning about future events can undermine the surprise element of the event itself. The prisoner's reasoning seems sound. If they know that the hanging cannot happen on the last day, they can eliminate each day one by one. But this leads to a logical loop where the hanging seems impossible, and yet it still happens. The paradox forces us to consider how expectations and reasoning can influence the actual outcome of an event, especially when that outcome seems contrary to our predictions. Knowledge, prediction, and certainty. The unexpected hanging paradox explores the relationship between knowledge, certainty, and surprise. The prisoner has full knowledge of the judge's statement and uses this knowledge to predict the day of the hanging. However, their prediction creates an expectation that contradicts the reality of the situation. The paradox suggests that the more information we have about an event, the more our predictive reasoning can interfere with the very thing we are trying to predict. This paradox also raises important questions about how we think about future events. If we know something with certainty, such as the judge's statement that the hanging will occur and will be a surprise, our reasoning process can make the outcome seem impossible, even though it is still entirely feasible. This shows the complexity of dealing with future events when knowledge about those events affects our expectations. The paradox is also an example of how rationality can lead us to conclusions that defy common sense. While it seems rational for the prisoner to believe that the hanging is impossible, this very reasoning sets them up for the surprise. It challenges our assumptions about predictability and how much we can actually know about future outcomes. The role of prediction in human experience. This paradox highlights an interesting feature of human prediction and expectation. When we know something is going to happen but are also told it will surprise us, we become caught in a loop of trying to predict when the event will happen, which eventually makes it impossible to identify the exact moment. This type of paradox is also seen in other thought experiments and scenarios where self-referential reasoning creates unexpected consequences. For example, this paradox is similar to the paradoxes of time travel. In many time travel paradoxes, the actions of people in the past influence the future in ways that seem to contradict their initial predictions. In the case of the unexpected hanging paradox, the prisoner's prediction about the hanging inadvertently sets in motion the very thing they sought to avoid, a surprise. Similarly, in time travel, knowledge of the future can change the events of the past in a way that leads to unexpected outcomes. This paradox is a reminder that knowledge can sometimes interfere with the reality we expect, and our ability to predict outcomes is not always as reliable as we might think. Even though the prisoner logically deduces the hanging cannot happen, their reasoning only leads to their ultimate surprise. Resolution of the paradox. One possible resolution of the paradox is that it highlights the limits of human knowledge. Even though the prisoner knows everything about the situation, and has logically deduced that the hanging cannot happen. Their reasoning is flawed because it does not account for the paradoxical nature of the situation. In a sense, their prediction of the hanging's impossibility prevents them from being able to anticipate the surprise. Another possible solution is to argue that human reasoning about future events is inherently limited and subject to uncertainty. Even if we know everything about the setup of a situation, we cannot always predict the outcome with certainty, especially when the setup involves surprise or contradictions. This solution would align with theories of indeterminacy in the philosophy of time and knowledge. In this view, the prisoner's failure to predict the outcome is not due to their lack of reasoning skills, but rather a result of the inherent unpredictability of the future. The more we know about future events, the more our expectations can influence the way we interpret those events. Ultimately, the unpredictability of the surprise is not a flaw in the prisoner's reasoning, but rather an essential feature of the nature of surprise itself. The paradox and human psychology. The unexpected hanging paradox also touches on aspects of human psychology. It explores how our expectations and mental models about the future can shape our experiences, often in ways that are counterproductive or contradictory. In this case, the prisoner's mental model of the week leads them to expect that the hanging cannot happen, but this expectation causes them to miss the surprise altogether. This is similar to the concept of cognitive bias, where our beliefs and expectations affect how we interpret information. The paradox shows that when we predict outcomes, our predictions can sometimes distort the reality of the situation. Even when we have the correct information about an event, our mental model of the event can cause us to misinterpret what will actually happen. Conclusion: the limits of prediction and knowledge. The unexpected hanging paradox forces us to reconsider the relationship between knowledge, prediction, and surprise. It reveals that even with full knowledge about an event, our reasoning and expectations can lead us to conclusions that defy the reality of the situation. The paradox challenges our assumptions about the limits of knowledge, suggesting that the more we know, the less we can predict with certainty, especially when the event involves surprise or self-referential reasoning. Ultimately, the paradox highlights the complexity of predicting future events and the unpredictable nature of human reasoning. Even when we are certain about an event, our expectations and predictions can interfere with the very outcome we seek to understand. The unexpected hanging paradox serves as a reminder that knowledge is not always enough to predict the future, and that surprise, paradoxically, can be an essential feature of human experience. The Ship of Theseus. Paradox, a deep dive. Imagine a grand, ancient ship docked in a harbor. Over time, its wooden planks begin to rot, and one by one, they are replaced with new ones. Eventually, every single piece of the ship has been swapped out for a fresh replacement. Now comes the mind-bending question: is it still the same ship? This is the Ship of Theseus Paradox, one of the most famous philosophical dilemmas about identity and change. It challenges the very foundation of how we define things over time. If an object is gradually replaced piece by piece, does it retain its original identity, or does it become something entirely new? The dilemma dates back to ancient Greece, where the historian Plutarch recorded how Theseus's ship was preserved by replacing parts as they decayed. But let's take it a step further. Suppose someone gathers all the old discarded planks and reconstructs the ship elsewhere. Now, we have two versions of the Ship of Theseus, one fully replaced in the harbor and another made of all the original parts. Which one is the real Ship of Theseus? Or are they both? Or neither? Philosopher Thomas Hobbes posed this very scenario in the 17th century, directly asking which of the two resulting ships would be the original. This paradox has fascinated thinkers for centuries, from ancient Greek philosophers to modern scientists and cognitive theorists. At its core, it forces us to question what truly defines identity. Is it the physical material, the continuity of function, or something more abstract, like the idea or pattern of the ship itself? The identity problem. What makes something the same? To answer this paradox, philosophers have taken different approaches. One argument is that identity is based on having the same original material. The original parts are what make the ship itself. By this logic, The reconstructed ship using the old planks would be the real ship of Theseus, while the continuously repaired version in the harbor is a replica. In other words, if none of the original matter remains in an object, then it's technically a different object. Another perspective is that identity is based on maintaining the same structure, form, or purpose over time. If something keeps working as or looking like the same thing, it remains that entity. In this view, the ship that stays in the harbor, gradually repaired with new timber, is still the ship of Theseus because its form and function continued uninterrupted. The fact that every plank was replaced doesn't matter, so long as the pattern or shape of the ship stays the same. And then, there's the more radical view that identity is not fixed at all. It's an illusion we impose for convenience. In reality, everything is in constant flux. By this argument, neither ship is truly the original because the original identity simply dissolved over time. This idea aligns with Buddhist and existentialist philosophies which suggest that all things, even the self, are impermanent and continuously changing. From that perspective, asking if something remains the same may be a misguided question to begin with. The ship of Theseus and the human body. Now let's make it personal. Imagine that the ship of Theseus isn't a ship, but you. Every cell in your body is constantly dying and being replaced. In fact, scientific studies estimate that within a span of 7 to 10 years, nearly every cell in your body has been refreshed or replaced. Biologically speaking, you are made up of entirely different matter than you were a decade ago. If we follow the logic of material continuity, then in a purely physical sense, you are an entirely different organism than your past self. But what about your memories, personality, and consciousness? If those have remained reasonably consistent, aren't you still you? Just like the ship that retains its form and function, perhaps your continuity of consciousness or personal narrative is what maintains your identity, even as your physical substance changes completely over time. This question of body versus mind highlights the ship of Theseus paradox within our own lives. Are you the same person you used to be, given that your body's components have all been replaced? Many would say yes, because something intangible, memory, mind, or soul, provides continuity. Others might say even your mind has changed, so you're never exactly the same person as before. The digital and technological implications. In the modern world, this paradox has taken on new relevance in discussions of technology and artificial intelligence. It's essentially the ship of Theseus applied to futuristic scenarios of transformation and upgrade. Imagine gradually transferring a human mind into a machine step by step, beginning with memory implants, augmenting the person's brain with artificial components that enhance or replace bits of memory. Then, add brain enhancements, replacing some neural circuits with electronic ones, slowly swapping biological neurons for silicon-based neurons. Eventually, upload the person's mind into a computer or android, such that none of the original biological brain remains. At what point during this process would the person cease to be human or cease to be the same person? Or do they remain essentially themselves through it all? This thought experiment mirrors the ship of Theseus. The ship here is the mind, and we're replacing it piece by piece with technology. Some might argue that as long as continuity of consciousness is preserved, like the ship's form and function, the identity remains intact. Others might insist that once you've swapped out the biological material entirely, the original person is gone. Similarly, consider an artificial intelligence that continuously updates and improves itself. If an AI rewrites its own code and grows more sophisticated each day, is it still the same AI that it started as, or a new entity altogether? At what point do incremental changes amount to a different identity? These questions aren't just science fiction. They strike at the heart of what it means for anything to persist over time in a world of upgrades and change. The emotional and psychological perspective. Beyond philosophy and technology, the ship of Theseus paradox also resonates with our personal growth and sense of self. Have you ever looked at an old photo of yourself and felt like you were looking at a different person? The way we change over time, our thoughts, beliefs, and perspectives, often makes it feel like we're evolving into someone new. Yet, we still generally think of ourselves as fundamentally the same person throughout life. Why is that? Perhaps it's because of an unbroken stream of experience and memory that creates a narrative of a single self. Human beings have a tendency to see their current self as the final version, underestimating how much they will continue to change. As psychologist Daniel Gilbert put it, human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. In other words, we impose a sense of continuity on ourselves, much like we do with the ship of Theseus, to make sense of our identity over time. It can be jarring to realize how much we've changed, mentally and physically. But we usually resolve that by viewing our past, present, and future selves as one evolving person rather than completely different people. So, can the paradox be solved? Philosophers, scientists, and thinkers still debate this paradox, and there is still no universal agreement on the answer. Some believe that there is no single true answer. Identity might just be a matter of perspective or definition. Others argue that identity is fluid and contextual, meaning an object or person can be both the same and not the same, depending on how you define your terms. For example, in one sense, the ship can be considered the same, functionally or conceptually, while in another sense, it's not the same, materially. In fact, after centuries of discussion, there have been no decisive solutions from antiquity to the modern era. The puzzle persists because it forces us to examine the assumptions behind words like same and identity. In the end, the ship of Theseus challenges us to rethink our assumptions about permanence, identity, and change. Whether applied to objects, our own bodies, or to digital minds, it reminds us that the world is constantly in motion and nothing stays completely unchanged. Perhaps the true lesson is that not every question has a clear-cut answer. Sometimes, embracing the ambiguity is more enlightening. So, next time you replace something, be it a part of a car, a home renovation, or even an old belief or idea, ask yourself, is it still the same, or has it become something entirely new? The trolley problem, a moral dilemma. Imagine you are standing at a lever beside a railway track. Ahead of you, there are 5 workers working on the track, completely unaware of the danger approaching. A trolley is racing down the track, and you can hear the screeching wheels getting closer and closer. You realize that unless you act, the trolley will continue on its path, and it will hit and kill all 5 workers. Now you have a decision to make. Next to the track is a lever that can change the trolley's direction to a second track, where only 1 worker is working. The trolley will go down this track if you pull the lever, and it will kill the single worker instead of the 5. Here's the question. Do you pull the lever, sacrificing 1 life to save 5? Or do you refrain from acting, allowing the trolley to continue and kill the 5 workers? This is the heart of the famous trolley problem, one of the most enduring and widely debated ethical dilemmas in modern philosophy. On the surface, the dilemma seems simple. It's about making a choice between saving the most lives or doing nothing and letting things unfold. But as we dig deeper into this problem, the situation becomes much more complex, revealing the tension between moral theories, human intuition, and ethical reasoning. The utilitarian approach, the greatest good for the greatest number. The trolley problem is often explored through the lens of utilitarianism, a moral philosophy that focuses on maximizing overall happiness and minimizing suffering. The most straightforward utilitarian answer to the dilemma is to pull the lever and sacrifice the 1 worker to save the 5. After all, saving 5 lives rather than 1 seems like the right choice from a utilitarian perspective. The idea is that the greater good is served by saving more lives, even if it means directly causing the death of 1 person. Utilitarianism operates on the principle of maximizing well-being. If you can prevent more harm by choosing to act, then that action is justified, regardless of the personal cost. In the case of the trolley problem, a utilitarian would argue that the right course of action is the one that results in the least overall harm, which would be switching the track to kill 1 instead of 5. This approach seems logical and efficient when applied to situations of life and death. But is it really as simple as just calculating the numbers? The deontological perspective, duty and moral rules. In contrast to utilitarianism, we have deontological ethics, a moral philosophy that focuses on following rules, principles, and duties rather than solely on the consequences of actions. Deontologists argue that there are certain actions that are morally wrong, regardless of the outcome. From a deontological perspective, pulling the lever to divert the trolley and cause the death of one person is morally impermissible, even if it would save 5 lives. The key argument here is that actively intervening to cause harm, even if it minimizes overall harm, is inherently wrong. In this case, the deontologist would argue that you cannot justify causing the death of one person, even for a seemingly greater good. The principle of not using another human being as a means to an end is crucial to deontological ethics. By pulling the lever, you would be directly causing the death of the single worker, which violates this ethical rule. According to this view, inaction might be morally preferable. Allowing the trolley to continue on its path, even though it will result in 5 deaths, may be the more ethical choice because you're not actively choosing to kill someone. The inaction allows the world to unfold as it will without your direct involvement in causing harm. So we are faced with a stark contrast. Do we act to save more lives even if it involves direct harm, or do we follow the rule of non-interference even at the cost of more lives? The moral tension. Can we reconcile both views? The trolley problem reveals the inherent tension between consequentialism, which focuses on outcomes, and deontological ethics, which focuses on actions. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that both ethical frameworks have their merits and weaknesses. On one hand, the utilitarian perspective encourages us to look at the bigger picture, where sacrificing one life is justified by saving more. On the other hand, deontology insists that there are some lines that cannot be crossed, no matter the potential benefits. This conflict isn't easily resolved, and philosophers have long debated how these two perspectives can coexist. For example, act utilitarianism suggests that we should always perform the action that maximizes overall happiness, while rule utilitarianism suggests that we should follow rules that generally lead to the best outcomes. In the context of the trolley problem, rule utilitarians might argue that the general rule should be to avoid intentionally killing anyone, even if it might lead to a greater harm. Meanwhile, a strict deontologist might maintain that we should never break moral rules, regardless of the situation. Moreover, some philosophers have proposed hybrid models of ethics that try to reconcile these two conflicting views. These models aim to balance moral rules with the consequences of actions, encouraging us to consider both the outcomes and the inherent value of moral principles. The variations of the trolley problem. The basic trolley problem can be adapted into various forms to test how people respond to moral dilemmas. In some variations, the worker on the track might be a loved one or a stranger, which can dramatically affect our decision-making. For example, imagine that instead of one worker, the person on the second track is your own child. Would that change your choice? Would you still pull the lever to save 5 people at the cost of 1, especially when the one person is someone you deeply care about? Such modifications add layers of emotional complexity to the dilemma, highlighting how our personal attachments and biases shape moral decisions. In another variation, the Fat Man version of the trolley problem presents a situation where the only way to stop the trolley is by pushing a heavy person off a bridge and onto the track, effectively using them to block the trolley and save the 5 people. This introduces another moral question. Is it morally acceptable to directly kill one person to save many, even when the action involves physical contact rather than just pulling a lever? These variations make the trolley problem all the more fascinating because they force us to examine the emotional and psychological aspects of moral decision-making. They show that, in real life, ethical dilemmas are rarely clear-cut and involve a complex web of emotions, personal beliefs, and social contexts. The real-world relevance. While the trolley problem might seem like an abstract thought experiment, it has practical implications in the real world. Many modern ethical issues, from healthcare to autonomous vehicles, involve similar dilemmas where life-or-death decisions must be made. In healthcare, for example, doctors often face decisions about how to allocate limited resources, such as organs for transplant, when there is not enough for everyone in need. Should they prioritize saving the most lives, or focus on saving individuals who are likely to benefit the most from treatment? The trolley problem also informs discussions about autonomous vehicles. Imagine an autonomous car has to make a split-second decision to avoid hitting 5 pedestrians. Should it swerve into a wall, killing the driver, or continue straight, killing the pedestrians? This type of moral programming is already being considered by engineers and ethicists who are working to create ethical guidelines for autonomous systems. In both cases, the trolley problem challenges us to consider how to make ethical decisions in a world full of complex life or death choices. So, what's the right answer? Ultimately, there may be no definitive answer to the trolley problem. The paradox highlights the deep moral ambiguity that arises in situations where both choices involve harm. It forces us to confront our moral intuitions, examine ethical principles, and reflect on the values that guide our decisions. Whether we choose to pull the lever or let the trolley continue on its path, we are forced to acknowledge the difficulty of making ethical choices when both options come with significant consequences. In the end, the trolley problem serves as a powerful reminder that moral decisions are rarely black and white. It teaches us to carefully consider the complexities of each situation, the values we hold dear, and the potential impacts of our actions. Zeno's paradoxes, the illusion of motion. Zeno of Elea, an ancient Greek philosopher, is famous for presenting a series of paradoxes that challenge our intuitive understanding of motion, time, and infinity. His paradoxes have been the subject of intense philosophical debate for over 2 millennia, and they remain a powerful tool for exploring the nature of reality, mathematics, and logic. Zeno's paradoxes typically revolve around the idea that motion or change is an illusion. One of his most famous paradoxes is the Achilles and the Tortoise Paradox, which challenges our concept of distance and time. However, Zeno's paradoxes go far deeper, questioning the very nature of motion itself. By presenting seemingly logical arguments that lead to absurd conclusions, Zeno forces us to reconsider our understanding of the world around us, particularly the concept of infinity and how it interacts with reality. The Achilles and the Tortoise Paradox. The Achilles and the Tortoise Paradox is one of Zeno's most famous and widely discussed paradoxes. The scenario goes like this. Imagine that Achilles, the swiftest of Greek heroes, is racing a tortoise. Achilles gives the tortoise a head start, and the race begins. The paradox is that, according to Zeno, Achilles will never catch the tortoise, no matter how fast he runs. This seems absurd at first because we know that Achilles is much faster than the tortoise and will eventually pass it. The reasoning behind the paradox is based on the idea that Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise started. By the time Achilles reaches that point, the tortoise has moved forward a little, so Achilles must then reach the new point where the tortoise has moved. But by the time Achilles reaches that second point, the tortoise has moved forward again, and so on. This process continues infinitely, so according to Zeno, Achilles can never catch the tortoise because there are an infinite number of steps he must take to reach it. This paradox seems illogical when viewed from the perspective of practical reality. We know that Achilles will eventually pass the tortoise. However, Zeno's paradox forces us to think about the infinite number of steps that must be taken to cover any distance, no matter how small. The Dichotomy Paradox. Another famous paradox proposed by Zeno is the Dichotomy Paradox, which challenges our understanding of how motion is divided. The scenario is as follows. In order to travel from point A to point B, you must first reach the halfway point. But before you can reach the halfway point, you must first reach the halfway point of that distance, and before that, the halfway point of that distance, and so on, ad infinitum. According to Zeno, this infinite division of space makes it impossible to ever reach point B, since there are an infinite number of steps that must be taken, no matter how small the intervals. The dichotomy paradox highlights the difficulty of understanding how something can be divided into an infinite number of parts. If space and time are infinitely divisible, how can we ever complete the task of reaching our destination? The paradox suggests that, at least logically, motion might be an illusion because an infinite number of divisions seems impossible to traverse in a finite amount of time. The Arrow Paradox. Zeno's Arrow Paradox challenges our perception of time and motion. In this paradox, Zeno argues that an arrow in flight cannot be said to be moving at any moment in time because at any specific moment, the arrow is at a single point in space. If the arrow is motionless at any given point in time, how can it be said to be moving? Zeno's reasoning is that if time is divided into an infinite number of moments, then at each individual moment, the arrow occupies a single position, and so it is not moving. But since the arrow is indeed in motion when observed over time, how can we reconcile the fact that motion seems to happen when each moment in time involves no motion? This paradox forces us to think about the nature of time. If time is divided into discrete moments, how can something be said to be moving when, at every individual moment, it occupies a fixed point in space? The arrow paradox challenges our understanding of time as a continuous flow and pushes us to consider whether time itself is divisible or continuous. The paradox of the infinite. The underlying theme of Zeno's paradoxes is the concept of infinity. Zeno's paradoxes, especially the Achilles and the tortoise and the dichotomy paradox, involve infinite divisions of space or time. But how can we traverse an infinite number of steps in a finite amount of time? This question touches on the concept of actual infinity versus potential infinity. Actual infinity refers to the idea of infinity as a completed fixed entity, while potential infinity refers to an infinite process that never reaches completion but continues indefinitely. Zeno's paradoxes seem to suggest that infinity, in the sense of actual infinity, creates a problem for our understanding of motion and space. If we encounter an infinite number of steps, then can we ever actually complete the task? This seems to suggest that the infinite nature of space and time is paradoxical, and perhaps even impossible to fully comprehend. However, modern mathematics has resolved this issue through the concept of limits. For example, when calculating the sum of an infinite series of decreasing distances, we can find a finite limit to that sum. This approach shows that although there are infinitely many steps, the total distance can still be finite and measurable. The resolution of Zeno's paradoxes in modern mathematics helps us understand that infinity is not necessarily a barrier to motion. It can be understood in a way that allows motion and distance to make sense. Zeno's paradoxes in modern physics. Zeno's paradoxes have profound implications not just for philosophy, but also for modern physics. The paradoxes highlight the difficulty of understanding continuous processes in a world that seems to be discrete and composed of finite parts. Zeno's problems with infinity are closely related to debates in physics about the nature of space, time, and the continuous versus discrete nature of reality. In quantum mechanics, for instance, the idea of continuous space and time is challenged by the theory that space is quantized, that is, it exists in discrete chunks or units. If this is true, Zeno's paradoxes would no longer apply because space and time would not be infinitely divisible. However, quantum mechanics has not fully resolved these questions, and the nature of space-time remains an area of active investigation in both physics and philosophy. Zeno's paradoxes also resonate with the ongoing debate in philosophy about the nature of space-time. If space and time are continuous, then Zeno's paradoxes seem to present an insurmountable challenge to our understanding of motion. But if space and time are discrete, then motion may be reconcilable with Zeno's paradoxes. This remains an open question in both physics and metaphysics. The mathematical resolution, limits and convergence. Modern mathematics provides a powerful way to resolve Zeno's paradoxes, particularly through the concept of limits. In the Achilles and the tortoise paradox, for instance, we can mathematically sum an infinite series of decreasing distances and find a finite value. The series 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16 converges to a finite sum of 1, even though it involves an infinite number of terms. This insight into infinite series and convergence allows us to understand that, while there may be an infinite number of steps involved in covering a distance, the total distance can still be finite. This mathematical resolution demonstrates that infinity does not lead to absurd or impossible outcomes, as Zeno suggested. Conclusion: the legacy of Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno's paradoxes have endured for over 2 millennia, and they continue to challenge our understanding of space, time, and motion. While modern mathematics and physics have provided solutions to many of the problems raised by Zeno, the paradoxes remain a rich source of philosophical reflection on the nature of infinity, continuity, and the limits of human perception. Zeno's paradoxes force us to confront the paradoxical nature of reality itself. They challenge our intuition, encouraging us to think more deeply about the world we live in and how we experience motion, time, and change. Even as science has advanced to explain away many of the problems Zeno posed, his paradoxes remain a testament to the enduring mystery of how we understand the infinite and the finite. The Liar's Paradox: Truth and Self-Reference. One of the most perplexing paradoxes in philosophy and logic is the Liar's Paradox. This paradox revolves around a simple yet profoundly troubling sentence. This statement is false. It's a paradox because if the statement is true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true. This creates a self-referential loop that seems to have no clear resolution. The Liar's Paradox challenges our understanding of truth, meaning, and language, and it has significant implications for how we think about logic, reasoning, and the nature of self-reference. The paradox typically takes the form of a sentence that refers to itself, making a statement about its own truth value. The most classic version is the statement, "This statement is false," which immediately leads to confusion. If the statement is true, then what it says must be true, meaning it's false. But if the statement is false, then it must be true. This creates a cycle of contradiction that seems impossible to resolve. The paradox in detail. To fully appreciate the Liar's Paradox, let's break down the two possibilities. Assume the statement is true. If this statement is false is true, then what it says must hold, that the statement is false. But this leads to a contradiction because the statement cannot both be true and false at the same time. If it's true, it must be false, which is logically impossible. Assume the statement is false. If the statement is false, then it is not the case that this statement is false. But if the statement is not false, then it must be true. But this, once again, leads us back to the original contradiction. The statement cannot be both true and false. So no matter how we approach the statement, we are stuck in a logical loop where the truth of the statement is dependent on its own falsity, and its falsity is dependent on its truth. The challenge of self-reference. The Liar's Paradox exposes the inherent problem of self-reference in language and logic. Self-referential statements, statements that refer to themselves, seem to defy the basic rules of truth and logic. This type of paradox is not just limited to simple sentences like, "This statement is false," but also appears in more complex logical structures, such as Russell's paradox, which concerns set theory and the self-referencing properties of sets. In fact, the Liar's Paradox is often seen as the starting point for a wider investigation into self-referential loops, which appear in various areas of logic, mathematics, and even computer science. The challenge of dealing with self-reference is central to understanding how logic systems can be constructed in a way that avoids contradictions. Historical context and philosophical implications. The Liar's Paradox has a long history in philosophy. It dates back to ancient Greece, where the philosopher Eubulides of Miletus first presented it as part of his exploration of paradoxes. Eubulides, a contemporary of Aristotle, is credited with discovering this paradox, which was later studied and refined by other philosophers and logicians. The paradox is particularly important in the development of logical theory. It highlights a critical issue in traditional logic systems: how to handle statements that seem to defy categorization as either true or false. Philosophers such as Aristotle, Gottlob Frege, and Bertrand Russell all attempted to understand and resolve this paradox. For instance, Aristotle's law of the excluded middle states that every proposition must either be true or false. But the Liar's Paradox forces us to question whether this law can hold in cases of self-reference. The paradox also raised significant questions for the development of set theory and mathematical logic, particularly through Russell's paradox. In set theory, Russell's paradox arises when we consider the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. Does this set contain itself or not? Like the Liar's Paradox, Russell's paradox creates a self-referential loop that cannot be resolved within the framework of classical logic. Solutions to the Liar's Paradox. There have been several attempts to resolve the Liar's Paradox, and these solutions fall into a few different categories. 1. The hierarchical solution, Tarski's approach. One well-known solution to the paradox was proposed by the logician Alfred Tarski, who suggested that we need to create a hierarchy of languages in order to avoid self-referential statements. According to Tarski, we can distinguish between a meta-language, a language used to talk about other languages, and the object language, the language that is being talked about. The key idea is that statements in the object language, like "this statement is false," can only be evaluated within the object language itself and cannot be used to talk about their own truth value in the meta-language. In this approach, we avoid the paradox by placing limits on how we talk about statements and their truth values. This solution essentially solves the liar's paradox by saying that a statement cannot refer to its own truth value without leading to a contradiction. Therefore, to talk about the truth of statements, we must always step outside the language in which those statements are made. 2. The paraconsistent logic solution. Another approach is paraconsistent logic, a type of logic that allows for contradictions to exist without undermining the entire system. In classical logic, a contradiction implies that everything is true, which is known as the principle of explosion. In contrast, paraconsistent logics allow for contradictory statements to exist simultaneously without rendering the whole system meaningless. By embracing contradictions, paraconsistent logic offers a way to handle paradoxes like the liar's paradox without collapsing into chaos. This approach is more tolerant of contradictions, allowing for both true and false evaluations to coexist. While this is an appealing solution for paradoxical statements, it challenges some of the fundamental principles of classical logic, especially the idea that every statement must be either true or false. 3. The dialetheism solution. Dialetheism is another approach that embraces contradictions by asserting that some statements can be both true and false at the same time. According to dialetheism, the liar's paradox is a genuine contradiction that must be accepted rather than resolved. In this view, the statement, "this statement is false," is both true and false simultaneously. This idea was developed within the framework of non-classical logic systems, such as relevant logic and paraconsistent logic. Dialetheism offers a way to treat paradoxical statements like the liar's paradox as true contradictions, allowing both truth and falsehood to coexist without invalidating the entire logical system. This solution is controversial, but has gained some support in the study of non-classical logic and philosophical paradoxes. 4. The contextual or pragmatic approach. Another solution is to argue that the liar's paradox arises not from any inherent contradiction in the statement itself, but from how we use language and concepts in different contexts. According to this contextual approach, we interpret statements based on the context in which they appear. In some contexts, the liar's statement can be considered false, and in others, it can be true. The paradox arises because the statement's truth value is context-dependent. This approach places less emphasis on formal logical systems and more on how language functions in practice. It suggests that the apparent contradiction arises from our failure to recognize the contextual limits of truth and reference. Philosophical implications of the liar's paradox. The liar's paradox raises important questions about language, meaning, and truth. It challenges the idea that truth is a simple, absolute property of statements, and instead suggests that our understanding of truth is complex and context-dependent. The paradox forces us to rethink how we understand language and how self-referential statements can disrupt our logical systems. Furthermore, the liar's paradox is often used as a metaphor for self-awareness and self-deception. Just as the liar's statement refers to itself in a contradictory way, human beings can sometimes be caught in self-referential loops of thought, where we deceive ourselves or struggle to understand our own motivations. This kind of self-awareness can lead to confusion, uncertainty, and paradoxical thinking, mirroring the logic of the paradox itself. Conclusion: the limits of language and logic. The liar's paradox is a profound challenge to the limits of language and logic. It exposes the difficulties inherent in self-reference and forces us to question the very foundations of truth, meaning, and reasoning. While there is no universally accepted solution to the paradox, it remains a central topic in the philosophy of language, logic, and epistemology. By grappling with the liar's paradox, we are reminded of the complexity and ambiguity that arise when we push the boundaries of language and thought. Ultimately, the paradox challenges us to think more deeply about how we define truth, how we use language, and how we understand the world around us. The problem of other minds. Can we truly know what others experience? One of the fundamental challenges in philosophy and human experience is understanding the minds of others. While we can interact with people, observe their behaviors, and communicate with them, we can never directly experience what it's like to be someone else. This gap in our understanding is at the heart of the problem of other minds, a philosophical issue that questions how we can ever truly know whether others experience the world in the same way that we do. The problem can be summed up with a simple but profound question. How do I know that other people have minds like mine? In other words, how can we be certain that other people have thoughts, feelings, consciousness, and experiences similar to our own? The experience of being aware, thinking, and feeling is what we call consciousness, and we are all intimately familiar with our own consciousness. But when it comes to others, we are forced to rely on indirect evidence, language, behavior, and social cues to infer that others have minds at all. But how can we be certain? The difficulty of knowing other minds. At the heart of the problem of other minds is the issue of epistemic access. We have direct access to our own thoughts and inner experiences, but we only have indirect access to those of others. When you experience pain, joy, or confusion, you are directly aware of it. But when someone else experiences these emotions, we can only observe their outward behavior and try to infer what's going on inside their mind. For example, imagine you're talking to a friend who is smiling. You might assume that they are happy, but you can't directly feel what they feel. What if they are smiling for some other reason, or even faking happiness? Similarly, when someone tells you they are in pain, you can sympathize and understand what it means to be in pain, but you can't actually feel the pain they are experiencing. You may try to empathize by recalling your own experience of pain, but you can never be completely sure that their experience is the same as yours. This problem extends far beyond simple empathy or social interaction. It goes to the very nature of what it means to have a mind at all. If I cannot know for sure what others are experiencing, how can I know that they have minds like mine? How can I know that they are not simply behaving in a way that mimics consciousness, but without actually experiencing it? The solipsism solution. Can I only know my own mind? One solution to the problem of other minds is solipsism, the idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. According to solipsism, everything outside of our own minds, other people, the external world, and even our own bodies, might just be projections of our consciousness. Solipsism suggests that we cannot know with certainty whether other minds exist at all. Perhaps all the people we encounter are merely creations of our mind, like characters in a dream, and we have no real way of proving otherwise. While solipsism offers a way to resolve the problem of other minds by asserting that only our own mind is certain, it is a deeply unsettling solution. It challenges the very concept of shared reality and social interaction. If we are the only minds that exist, then all of our relationships, experiences, and interactions are meaningless. The world would become an incredibly lonely place if we believed that no one else truly existed or had a mind like ours. This radical form of skepticism can be difficult to accept, as it undermines the foundations of our social and moral lives. It's clear that we don't experience the world in isolation. We rely on others for companionship, support, and knowledge. Thus, solipsism may provide a theoretical answer, but it doesn't offer a satisfying or meaningful resolution to the problem. The behavioral and physicalist solution. Another approach to the problem of other minds is to rely on behavioral evidence and physicalism. This perspective argues that, since we can observe people's behaviors and bodily reactions to different stimuli, we can reasonably infer that they have minds that function similarly to our own. For example, when someone speaks about their thoughts and feelings, or reacts to external events in ways that we recognize as human, we assume that they must be experiencing something akin to our own thoughts and emotions. This is based on the idea that mental states are tied to physical states. If we assume that other people's brains function similarly to ours and that their behaviors reflect inner mental states, then we can conclude that they are likely experiencing the world in ways that are similar to our own. For example, when we see someone react to a painful stimulus, we assume that they are feeling pain, because we know from our own experience that the sensation of pain corresponds with a particular set of physical reactions, such as wincing or vocalizing discomfort. This approach doesn't provide direct access to other people's minds, but it offers a practical way to make inferences about their inner experiences. By relying on behavioral consistency and similar physical responses, we can conclude that others are likely conscious beings with minds similar to ours. However, this solution leaves open the possibility that other minds may be different from our own in ways we cannot perceive, making it an imperfect solution. The argument from analogy: are other minds like mine? A key approach to solving the problem of other minds is the argument from analogy. This argument suggests that since we know what it is like to be conscious and to have experiences, we can reasonably assume that other beings with similar physical traits and behaviors are also conscious. In other words, if we know that our own minds are connected to our brains and bodies, and if we observe that other beings have similar brains and bodies, it's reasonable to infer that their minds are also similar to ours. This is similar to how we might make other inferences based on analogy. For example, if we know that one object is hot, and we observe that another object is similar in shape and material, we might infer that the second object is also hot. Similarly, if we observe that other people behave in ways similar to how we behave when we experience certain emotions, we might conclude that they are also experiencing those emotions. The argument from analogy relies on inference, the process of drawing conclusions based on patterns and similarities. By observing other people's actions, facial expressions, and reactions to the world, we infer that they are likely experiencing the same or similar thoughts and feelings that we do. While this approach doesn't provide definitive proof of the existence of other minds, it offers a practical way of understanding others and forming social connections. The problem of animal minds. The problem of other minds is not just limited to human beings. It also extends to the question of whether non-human animals have minds and consciousness like ours. We know that animals exhibit behaviors that suggest they are experiencing emotions and sensations. For example, dogs wag their tails when happy or cower when scared. However, we can't directly access their inner experiences, and we can never know for certain whether they experience the world in the same way we do. This raises profound ethical questions. If we cannot be certain that animals have minds like ours, how can we justify their treatment in society? Are animals entitled to rights and protections based on their ability to feel pain or experience emotions? The moral consideration of animal minds is an extension of the problem of other minds and a key issue in contemporary ethical debates about animal welfare. Conclusion: can we know other minds? The problem of other minds invites us to confront one of the most fundamental challenges of human existence: the gap between our inner experiences and the experiences of others. While we cannot directly access the thoughts and feelings of other people, we rely on a variety of strategies, behavior, analogy, and physical evidence to infer that others have minds like ours. Ultimately, the problem of other minds remains an open question in philosophy. While we can never have direct access to the inner experiences of others, we continue to navigate the world with the assumption that they, too, experience consciousness and have minds similar to our own. Whether we accept solipsism, the argument from analogy, or behavioral evidence, the problem of other minds reminds us of the limitations of our understanding. It challenges us to reflect on our assumptions about consciousness, empathy, and our relationship with others, and to consider the nature of what it means to be truly aware. The Grandfather Paradox, a time travel dilemma. Time travel is a fascinating concept that has captured the imagination of philosophers, scientists, and science fiction enthusiasts for centuries. What if you could travel back in time and change events in history? Could you alter the course of your life, or even the future? The Grandfather Paradox presents a mind-bending twist on the idea of time travel, forcing us to grapple with questions about causality, free will, and the very nature of time. The paradox goes like this. Imagine you have access to a time machine, and you decide to travel back to a time before your grandfather had children. Once there, you accidentally prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, which means he never marries her, and, as a result, you are never born. Now, here's the kicker. If you were never born, How could you have traveled back in time to prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother in the first place? This creates an impossible loop. If you prevent your birth, you also prevent yourself from going back in time, which would have prevented your birth in the first place. So, the central question of the grandfather paradox is, can time travel be consistent, or does it create logical contradictions that make it impossible? The logic of causality and time travel. At the heart of the grandfather paradox is the issue of causality, the relationship between cause and effect. In our everyday experience, causes precede effects in a linear fashion. If you turn on a light switch, the light turns on. If you break a glass, it shatters. The flow of time is typically understood as being irreversible. Events happen in a specific order, and once something occurs, it cannot be undone without violating the rules of cause and effect. Time travel introduces the possibility of changing the past, and this is where the grandfather paradox begins to unravel the logic of causality. If you could go back in time and alter events, you could, in theory, change the entire course of history. But the paradox shows that if you change something significant in the past, like preventing your own birth, you create a logical contradiction. The action of changing the past, preventing your birth, would erase the possibility of you traveling to the past in the first place, causing an infinite loop of paradoxes. This problem lies at the very core of time travel. Can the past truly be altered, or is the future somehow fixed and immutable? If time travel is possible, it raises difficult questions about whether the flow of time is flexible or whether it operates according to strict, unchangeable rules. The multiple universes solution. One way to resolve the grandfather paradox is through the concept of parallel universes or multiverses. According to this theory, time travel doesn't actually alter the original timeline. Instead, when you travel back in time and change an event, like preventing your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you create a new parallel universe in which the altered events unfold. In this new universe, you might never have been born, but the original timeline where you did exist still continues to exist separately. This concept suggests that instead of erasing your existence in a paradoxical loop, you are simply branching off into a different reality. This theory is grounded in the idea of quantum mechanics and the many worlds interpretation, which proposes that every time a choice is made, the universe splits into multiple parallel realities, each reflecting one of the possible outcomes. In the case of the grandfather paradox, if you go back in time and change something critical, like your birth, it doesn't erase your original timeline. It creates an entirely new timeline where the cause and effect chain unfolds differently. You don't paradoxically erase yourself from existence. You merely create a new branch of reality. This solution provides a way to reconcile time travel with the continuity of causality. It allows for the possibility of changing the past without creating contradictions, as each change creates a new universe, separate from the one you started in. However, this solution raises its own set of philosophical questions. If there are infinite parallel universes, where does the real timeline exist? And how do we determine which reality is truly ours? The fixed timeline solution. Another possible solution to the grandfather paradox is the idea of a fixed timeline. According to this theory, time travel might be possible, but the past is immutable. It cannot be changed. In this view, no matter how hard you try, you will never be able to prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother or alter any other crucial event in history. If you travel back in time to prevent your birth, some unforeseen event will occur to make sure that you are still born and that the timeline remains intact. This solution is based on the idea that the universe has a built-in self-consistency that prevents paradoxes from happening. Essentially, the timeline will protect itself from any changes that would create contradictions. In the case of the grandfather paradox, you might try to prevent your birth, but something will always happen that ensures that you are born anyway. Perhaps you'll fail to prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, or perhaps your actions will lead to the same outcome in a different way. The timeline ensures that the past remains the same, regardless of what you do in the present. The self-consistency principle has been explored in both science fiction and physics. For example, in the film 12 Monkeys, the protagonist is sent back in time to stop the release of a deadly virus. only to discover that his actions are part of the very chain of events that leads to the outbreak. In this version of time travel, the timeline doesn't allow for paradoxes because it actively prevents them, ensuring that the past unfolds as it is meant to. The paradoxes of free will. The grandfather paradox also raises important questions about free will and whether our actions in the present truly have the power to change the past. If time travel exists and the past can be altered, then does that mean we have control over the future? Can we rewrite history, or are we bound by a predetermined timeline that cannot be changed? The paradox suggests that if we could change the past, we would be faced with the possibility of erasing our very selves from existence, which raises deeper questions about the role of free will in our lives. If the timeline is truly fixed, then our actions might not be as free as we believe. The very act of trying to change the past, and the paradox it creates, suggests that we are bound by the events that have already happened. In this view, free will might only be an illusion, a perception we hold in the present, but one that may not extend to our ability to influence the past or the future. If the timeline is immutable, then perhaps our choices are not as significant as we think. The ethical and emotional implications. The grandfather paradox also brings up some ethical and emotional considerations. If time travel is possible and we can change the past, what responsibilities do we have in doing so? For example, if we have the power to prevent tragedies or atrocities from occurring, should we? If we travel back in time to stop the death of a loved one or avert a war, is it ethical to alter the course of history? Even if it would lead to better outcomes, the very act of interfering with the past could have unforeseen consequences, potentially causing harm in ways we cannot predict. Moreover, the emotional consequences of altering the past are deeply troubling. If we could travel back in time and change something critical in our lives, would we lose the people or experiences that have shaped us? What happens if you erase yourself from existence? Could you live with the knowledge that you changed the course of history, and that in doing so, you may have lost everything you know and love? Conclusion. Can time travel exist without paradoxes? The grandfather paradox forces us to confront the complexities of time travel, causality, and free will. If time travel were possible, it seems to create insurmountable paradoxes that challenge our understanding of how events unfold. While solutions like the many worlds interpretation or the fixed timeline might provide a way to resolve these paradoxes, they raise even more profound philosophical questions about the nature of reality, choice, and the consequences of our actions. Ultimately, the grandfather paradox invites us to reflect on the nature of time itself and whether it is possible to truly alter the past. Whether or not time travel ever becomes a reality, the paradox serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of time and the intricate web of causality that governs our lives. Time travel may be a fascinating concept, but the paradoxes it presents challenge us to question what we truly know about the flow of time and the possibility of rewriting history. The simulation hypothesis. Are we living in a computer? Have you ever wondered if the world you experience, everything from the air you breathe to the conversations you have, might actually be a simulation? This thought-provoking question is at the heart of the simulation hypothesis, a modern philosophical dilemma that asks, what if everything around us, from the people we interact with to the very universe itself, is a computer simulation? The idea is that advanced civilizations, perhaps far more technologically advanced than our own, have created simulations that are so sophisticated they mimic the real world to the point where the inhabitants of these simulations, us, for example, don't even realize they are living in one. In this scenario, our entire existence, our thoughts, experiences, and perceptions are merely the products of a hyper-advanced computer system. The simulation hypothesis challenges everything we know about reality and existence, forcing us to ask, are we real or are we just data in a program? The origins of the simulation hypothesis. The roots of the simulation hypothesis can be traced to the philosophical musings of Descartes and his skepticism about the nature of reality. Descartes famously questioned everything in his search for certainty, ultimately concluding that the only thing he could be sure of was his own existence. Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. In the modern age, The concept of simulated reality was introduced and popularized by philosopher Nick Bostrom in his 2003 paper, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? Bostrom presented the idea that future civilizations might have the capability to create highly detailed simulations of reality, and that the inhabitants of these simulations would have no way of knowing they weren't real. Bostrom's argument is based on three key points. First, that technological advancements will eventually allow future civilizations to create simulations indistinguishable from reality. Second, that advanced civilizations might have an interest in running such simulations to study their ancestors or experiment with different scenarios. And third, that if such simulations are possible, it's more likely that we are currently living in one than that we are in the base reality, simply because there could be countless simulations running at any given time, and only one base reality. The simulation hypothesis is also closely tied to the concept of digital simulation. In the modern era, with the development of virtual reality, VR, and the increasing sophistication of computer models, the idea that our entire universe could be a simulation created by an advanced civilization seems more plausible than ever before. As VR technology advances, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between a simulated world and the real world. Could it be that the universe itself is just an incredibly detailed program running on some unknown computer in the far reaches of space or time? The Matrix, a cultural touchstone for simulated reality. While the philosophical underpinnings of the simulation hypothesis are serious and grounded in academia, it has also become a staple of popular culture, most famously represented by the Matrix film trilogy. In The Matrix, humanity is unknowingly living in a simulated reality created by machines to pacify the human population, while their bodies are used as an energy source. The protagonist, Neo, discovers the truth about the simulation and must decide whether to accept the harsh reality of the real world or remain in the comfortable, artificial simulation. The Matrix films tap into a deep universal fear of being deceived about the nature of reality. They ask the question, what if everything we think we know about the world is just a lie? The concept of the red pill, a symbol of awakening to the truth of reality, has become a cultural shorthand for the desire to see the world as it truly is, free from illusions. The Matrix is not just a work of fiction, but a reflection of a very real philosophical dilemma that has been debated for centuries. The film poses a challenge that is deeply unsettling. How can we ever truly know if we're living in the real world? Could our entire existence be nothing more than a computer simulation designed to mimic reality? The philosophical implications of the simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis raises a series of profound philosophical questions. If we are living in a simulation, what does that mean for the nature of reality? Can we trust our perceptions of the world if they are just part of a computer program? Does it matter if our world is a simulation, as long as we experience it as real? And if we are simulations, does that mean our lives have less value or meaning? One of the most interesting aspects of the simulation hypothesis is its challenge to our understanding of consciousness. If we are simply programs in a computer, then what does that say about our minds, our thoughts, and our experiences? Are they real, or are they just data points processed by a machine? In other words, if we are living in a simulation, do we have free will? Are we simply following a predetermined script programmed into us by the creators of the simulation? This leads to the question of control. If we are part of a simulation, then who is in charge of the program? Who are the creators of the simulation, and what are their intentions? Are they simply observing us, like scientists studying lab rats, or do they have some other, more sinister purpose? The notion of being controlled by an external force can be deeply unsettling, raising ethical questions about the treatment of simulated beings and their rights. The simulation argument, the probability of being simulated. One of the most compelling aspects of the simulation hypothesis is the simulation argument. According to Bostrom, it is statistically more likely that we are living in a simulation than in the base reality. He argues that if advanced civilizations have the ability to create simulations, they would likely create many simulations, far more than the number of base realities. If there are a vast number of simulations running, then the probability that we are living in one of them is incredibly high. In essence, Bostrom's argument suggests that the odds of being in the real world are infinitesimally small compared to the odds of being in a simulation. This idea is rooted in probability theory and the concept of ancestor simulations. If a civilization has the ability to simulate consciousness, it's likely they would run simulations of their ancestors, studying their past, or experimenting with different scenarios. As more and more simulations are created, the likelihood that we are in a real physical universe rather than a simulated one becomes increasingly unlikely. Some critics of the simulation hypothesis argue that Bostrom's argument is purely speculative and that there's no concrete evidence to support the idea that advanced civilizations could create simulations of this scale. Others point out that the hypothesis raises troubling questions about purpose and meaning. If we are living in a simulation, does it mean that our lives are meaningless, or that we are simply pawns in a game played by someone else? The technological perspective: advancements in virtual reality. With the advent of virtual reality, VR, the simulation hypothesis has taken on new significance. As VR technology advances, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish between simulated environments and the real world. In a VR world, we can touch, see, and interact with objects, and the experiences we have can feel just as real as those in the physical world. This raises a critical question. If our technology continues to improve, could we one day create a simulation that is indistinguishable from reality? And if we can create such simulations, does that mean it's possible that our entire universe is already one of them? Some futurists and technologists, such as Elon Musk, have expressed their belief that we may eventually reach a point where we can create simulations so advanced that it would be nearly impossible for their inhabitants to know they are in a simulation. Musk has argued that given the exponential growth of computing power, it's not unreasonable to believe that we could eventually simulate entire universes, including the experiences of conscious beings living in those simulated worlds. The ethical questions of a simulated reality. The simulation hypothesis doesn't just raise questions about reality and existence, but also about ethics. If we are living in a simulation, what rights do we have as simulated beings? Are we subject to the whims of the creators of the simulation, or do we have the ability to make our own choices? The ethical implications of creating simulated worlds, especially if those worlds contain conscious beings, are vast and unsettling. Should the creators of simulations treat their inhabitants with respect and dignity, or are simulated lives of no moral consequence? Some have suggested that the creators of simulations would have a moral obligation to ensure the well-being of the beings within their simulations, just as we have ethical considerations when creating artificial intelligence or other forms of sentient technology. If simulations can contain beings that experience pain, pleasure, or consciousness, then the ethical questions become even more complex. Conclusion: are we living in a simulation? The simulation hypothesis forces us to confront our deepest assumptions about reality, consciousness, and existence. It challenges us to ask whether we can trust our perceptions of the world around us and whether we are truly living in the real world or merely in a highly advanced simulation. Whether we are living in a simulation or not, the idea encourages us to think critically about the nature of reality and our place in it. While there is currently no concrete evidence to support or refute the simulation hypothesis, it remains a fascinating and thought-provoking topic of philosophical debate. Whether we are real or simulated, the experiences we have and the lives we lead are meaningful to us. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that our perceptions of the world, no matter how real or simulated, shape our lives and our understanding of existence. The brain in a vat, a philosophical dilemma. Imagine this scenario. You are lying in a lab, completely unaware, while your brain is floating in a vat of liquid. All of your sensory inputs, sight, sound, touch, are being fed into the brain through sophisticated electrodes and computers. These computers create a highly convincing simulation of the world, one that feels entirely real to you. Your thoughts, memories, and emotions are all a part of this simulation. Now, the mind-bending question arises. How can you be sure that you're not just a brain in a vat? This is the essence of the brain in a vat thought experiment, a philosophical dilemma that questions the nature of reality and our perception of the world around us. It is an exploration of what it means to know something, how we can trust our experiences, and whether we can ever truly be certain of the reality we live in. The origins of the brain in a vat. The brain in a vat scenario is rooted in skepticism, particularly the skepticism of knowledge. One of the earliest and most influential philosophers to question the nature of reality in this way was René Descartes. Descartes famously doubted everything in his pursuit of certainty, arriving at the idea of radical doubt. He proposed that there might be an evil demon manipulating our perceptions, making us believe in a world that doesn't exist. This was the foundation for his famous statement, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, as he realized that even if everything else was an illusion, the very act of doubting proved his own existence. In the modern version of the brain in a vat scenario, the idea is that you could be a brain floating in a vat, completely disconnected from the physical world, but your brain is being fed sensory information that makes you think you are experiencing a normal life. Your interactions with the world, your memories, your thoughts, they're all being manipulated by an external source. The question is, how can you know for sure that you're not living in such a simulation? The problem of perception. How do we know what's real? The brain in a vat raises serious questions about perception and reality. Our knowledge of the world comes through our senses. We see, hear, touch, taste, and smell things, and we trust these experiences to give us a true representation of the world around us. But what if our senses are entirely manipulated? What if every sensation you experience is artificially created, and the world around you doesn't actually exist? This question is particularly challenging in the context of epistemology, the study of knowledge. How do we know anything about the external world if we can't trust our own senses? We assume that our sensory experiences are generally accurate and reflective of the world, but the brain in a vat scenario challenges this assumption. It suggests that all of our experiences could be illusions, manipulated by an external force, leaving us unable to trust what we perceive as real. One of the key aspects of this thought experiment is the simulation hypothesis, which posits that what we think of as reality might actually be a computer-generated simulation. If our perceptions can be replicated by a machine, how do we distinguish between a real world and a simulated one? Could we ever truly know the difference? If everything we experience is created by a computer, it would feel just as real to us as the world we think we live in. The concept of external reality. To understand the dilemma posed by the brain in a vat, we need to consider the concept of external reality, the idea that there is a world outside of our minds that exists independently of our thoughts and perceptions. If we can't rely on our senses to tell us what's real, how can we prove that the world exists as we perceive it? The problem of external reality leads to the philosophical debate known as solipsism. Solipsism is the belief that only one's own mind is sure to exist, and everything outside of it, including other people, the physical world, and the universe itself, may just be a projection of the mind. If we are nothing more than brains in vats, then our entire experience of the world could be an illusion. Philosophers who question the existence of external reality often point to the limitations of our senses and the possibility of deception. For example, if a brain in a vat can experience a simulated world through sensory inputs, then what makes our experiences any different from that? If we can't prove that what we experience isn't just a simulation, then the distinction between a real world and an illusion becomes blurry. The argument from deception: can we trust our minds? The brain in a vat thought experiment also connects to another powerful philosophical concept, the problem of deception. If we assume that our senses are the ultimate source of information about the world, then we must acknowledge that they can be deceived. Optical illusions, dreams, and hallucinations all show us that what we perceive may not always be an accurate reflection of reality. If we can be deceived by our senses in such everyday situations, then how can we be certain that we are not being deceived on a grander scale? The brain in a vat scenario suggests that, in theory, a highly sophisticated simulation could deceive us into thinking we are experiencing a real world when, in fact, we are not. This raises questions about the nature of perception and the reliability of our minds. There's an interesting twist here. Even if we are brains in vats, we still experience the world as if it were real. To us, our sensations, thoughts, and experiences feel just as genuine as they would if they were based on a real external world. This creates a paradox. If the world we experience is an illusion, does that make it any less real? Should the fact that we perceive it as real be enough to make it meaningful to us? The limits of knowledge and certainty. The brain in a vat scenario also raises deep questions about knowledge and certainty. If we cannot know for certain that the world around us is real, then what can we truly know? The dilemma suggests that we may be trapped in a cycle of skepticism, unable to prove anything about the external world. Just as Descartes questioned everything in his search for certainty, the brain in a vat scenario forces us to confront the possibility that we can never truly know anything about the world beyond our own minds. This leads to what some philosophers call the epistemic problem, the challenge of how we can know anything with absolute certainty. If we can't trust our senses or perception of reality, then is there any way to overcome this skepticism? Some philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, have argued that while we may not be able to prove the existence of an external reality, we can still know certain things about the way the world appears to us. Others, like David Hume, have suggested that even though we can't be certain about the world, we should still rely on experience and reason to guide our actions. The brain in a vat and the digital age. In the modern world, the brain in a vat thought experiment has taken on new relevance with the rise of virtual reality, VR, and digital simulations. In fact, it's remarkably similar to what we experience when we engage with VR technologies. When we wear a VR headset, our sensory inputs are manipulated to create the illusion of being in a completely different world, even though we are simply interacting with a computer-generated environment. The question becomes, if we can be fully immersed in a digital world, how can we ever be sure that the world we think is real isn't just another simulation? This brings the brain in a vat dilemma into the realm of technology and artificial intelligence. As virtual worlds become more sophisticated and indistinguishable from reality, the lines between what is real and what is simulated become increasingly difficult to draw. Could it be that we are already living in a simulation and don't even realize it? The simulation hypothesis, the idea that our entire existence could be a computer-generated simulation, echoes the concerns raised by the brain in a vat thought experiment, inviting us to question the nature of existence itself. Conclusion: can we ever be sure? The brain in a vat thought experiment forces us to confront fundamental questions about reality, perception, and knowledge. It challenges us to think critically about what we can truly know and whether we can ever be certain of anything beyond our own minds. While we may never be able to prove with absolute certainty that we are not brains in vats, the paradox serves as a powerful reminder that reality is not as straightforward as we often assume. Perhaps, in the end, the most important lesson of the brain in a vat scenario is not about finding definitive answers, but about recognizing the limits of our knowledge and embracing the mystery of existence. After all, even if we are brains in vats, the experiences we have, the feelings, thoughts, and sensations still shape our lives and our understanding of the world. Whether or not the world is real in the traditional sense, it remains real to us in the most meaningful way possible. The Sorites Paradox, the problem of vagueness. The Sorites Paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, is a philosophical problem that deals with vagueness and how we make decisions when things change incrementally. The paradox is named after the Greek word soros, meaning heap, and it involves the difficulty of drawing precise boundaries in situations where small changes accumulate gradually, leading to a significant effect. The Sorites Paradox can be presented in a simple, yet mind-boggling way. Imagine you have a heap of sand. If you remove a single grain of sand, it still seems like a heap, right? But if you continue to remove grains one by one, at some point, you'll be left with just a small pile of sand. But at what point does it cease to be a heap? Can we say that a heap of sand with one grain removed is no longer a heap? The paradox challenges our ability to define when a collection of grains ceases to be a heap based on small, seemingly insignificant changes. The Sorites Paradox essentially asks, how can we draw a clear line between things that are heap and things that are not heap when the process of removing grains is gradual and continuous? The paradox explained. Here's the core of the paradox. We begin with a heap of sand, and each time we remove a grain of sand, it seems unreasonable to argue that we have changed the nature of the object significantly. But as we continue to remove grains of sand, at some point, we are left with only a single grain or even no grains at all. When did the heap stop being a heap? Removing one grain of sand at a time seems to have no significant effect, so we could continue to remove grains indefinitely without ever reaching a point where the sand is no longer considered a heap. This raises several important questions. When does a heap of sand stop being a heap? At what point can we say that we no longer have a heap? Is it the quantity of sand that matters, or is there something else at play, like the arrangement or condition of the sand? Vagueness and the Sorites Paradox. The Sorites Paradox is primarily concerned with vagueness, the idea that some concepts are not sharply defined but are instead subject to gradual change. The paradox illustrates that many terms we use in everyday language, like heap, bald, or rich, don't have clear-cut boundaries. These terms refer to concepts that exist on a spectrum, and the boundaries between categories are blurry. For example, the term heap doesn't come with a specific definition of how many grains of sand constitute a heap. There is no exact number of grains where we can say, this is the tipping point where it becomes a heap. Similarly, the term bald doesn't specify how many hairs one can lose before they are considered bald, nor does rich have a universally accepted monetary threshold. The Sorites Paradox forces us to grapple with the idea that categories are often not as precise as we think, and many concepts in language are subject to gradual changes that don't fit neatly into binary categories, like heap versus non-heap. The paradox of baldness. An extension of the Sorites paradox is the paradox of baldness. In this scenario, the paradox arises from the vagueness of the term bald. If a person loses a single hair, they are still not considered bald. But as they lose more hairs, at what point do they cross the line and become bald? Losing one hair doesn't make someone bald, but does losing, say, 50 hairs? 100? At what point does the person transition from not bald to bald? This paradox demonstrates how challenging it is to define concepts that involve gradation. Much like the heap of sand, the term bald doesn't have a precise point of transition. Each hair that is lost doesn't seem to change the person's status, but eventually, there must be a point where a person goes from having hair to being bald. The paradox lies in identifying when that change occurs. The paradox of richness. Similarly, the Sorites paradox can be applied to the concept of richness. How many dollars does one need to be considered rich? If you have $1 more than someone, does that make you rich? If we start with someone who is not rich and they gain small amounts of money, at what point do they become rich? Like the terms heap and bald, rich is a concept that involves continuity without a clear-cut point of transition. It's not easy to determine the threshold at which a person's wealth shifts from not rich to rich. This extension of the Sorites paradox highlights how vague terms can complicate our understanding of categories and lead us to arbitrary decisions when trying to determine exactly when a category change happens. The problem of precise boundaries. The Sorites paradox forces us to acknowledge the problem of precise boundaries in language and categorization. Many concepts we take for granted are not as clear-cut as we assume. For example, how many grains of sand do you need to form a heap? The paradox demonstrates that no matter how many grains you add to a pile, it's difficult to define a precise point at which the pile becomes a heap. Similarly, the paradox shows how challenging it is to define terms that describe gradual phenomena, such as height, weight, or age. This challenge is evident in philosophy and law, where definitions and categories play an essential role in the way we organize knowledge, make decisions, and form judgments. The Sorites paradox shows that some terms might lack the sharp boundaries we expect, and that many of our everyday categories might be subject to interpretation. The solution: epistemic and contextual approaches. There are several proposed solutions to the Sorites paradox, but no definitive resolution. However, these solutions shed light on different ways to approach the problem of vagueness. 1. Epistemic approach. Knowledge-based solution. One approach to resolving the Sorites paradox is through an epistemic solution, which suggests that the problem arises from our lack of knowledge about where the exact boundary lies. While it may be difficult to determine when a heap of sand stops being a heap, this does not mean the boundary doesn't exist. It's just that we don't know where it is. According to this view, the paradox does not imply that categories are meaningless. Rather, it suggests that our inability to define them precisely is a matter of epistemic limitation. 2. Contextual approach. Vagueness as a contextual problem. Another solution is the contextual approach, which argues that the meaning of vague terms depends on the context in which they are used. For instance, when we talk about a heap of sand in everyday conversation, we might not expect precision. However, in certain contexts, like in a scientific experiment, the term heap may need to be defined more rigorously. This solution suggests that the boundaries of vague terms are context-dependent, and what counts as a heap or baldness may vary depending on the context in which they are applied. 3. Degree theory, fuzzy logic. In fuzzy logic, the idea is that many concepts are not binary but exist on a continuum. According to fuzzy logic, rather than categorizing something strictly as heap or non-heap, we could assign degrees of heapness based on how many grains are in the pile. Similarly, we could say that someone is more bald or less bald depending on how many hairs they have left. This solution acknowledges that vagueness exists, but suggests that we can address it mathematically by allowing for degrees of membership in a category. Conclusion: the limits of language and thought. The Sorites Paradox is a powerful reminder of the limits of language and conceptualization. It challenges our ability to define categories with precision, particularly in cases where changes occur gradually. The paradox also raises important philosophical questions about how we define terms like heap, bald, and rich, and how these terms are shaped by vagueness and context. Although there is no definitive solution to the Sorites Paradox, it continues to be a valuable tool for understanding the complexities of language, meaning, and categorization. Whether through epistemic limitations, contextual adjustments, or fuzzy logic, the Sorites Paradox invites us to think more carefully about how we define the world and how we deal with concepts that resist precise boundaries. The two envelopes. Paradox. Decision-making under uncertainty. The two envelopes. Paradox is a famous problem in probability theory and decision theory, and it challenges our understanding of rational decision-making when faced with uncertainty. The paradox begins with a simple scenario involving two envelopes, each containing an unknown amount of money. One envelope contains twice as much money as the other. You are allowed to choose one envelope and, after seeing the amount of money in it, can switch to the other envelope if you wish. The question is, should you switch envelopes after seeing the amount in your chosen envelope? The paradox arises when you think about the expected value of switching envelopes. Imagine that you choose one envelope and find that it contains an amount of money, let's call it X. The other envelope could contain either twice the amount in your envelope or half the amount. This seems like a 50-50 chance for each possibility. So, at first glance, you might think that it's better to switch, because if the other envelope contains twice the amount, you'd benefit from switching. But here's where it gets paradoxical. If you reason this way and then apply the same reasoning again after switching, you seem to end up in an infinite loop of always switching, because it always seems like switching gives you a better expected value. Let's walk through this in words. If the first envelope contains X, then the second envelope could either contain 2X, twice as much, or X2, half as much, each with a 50% chance. You calculate the expected value of switching by averaging these two possible amounts. There is a 50% chance that the second envelope contains 2X, which gives you 2X. There is also a 50% chance that the second envelope contains X2, which gives you X2. To calculate the expected value, you add these two possible outcomes together, the chance of 2X plus the chance of X2. When you do this, you find that the expected value of switching is greater than the amount in the envelope you originally chose. Specifically, it turns out that the expected value of switching is X plus X divided by 4, which is equivalent to 5X divided by 4. This suggests that the expected value of switching is higher than the original envelope's value, meaning that it seems rational to switch. But here's the paradox. This reasoning suggests that you should always switch because for any value x, the expected value of switching is greater than the current value you hold. This leads to a contradiction because if you keep applying the reasoning, it seems like you should keep switching indefinitely, which is clearly not a sensible conclusion. The paradox explained. The paradox arises from the fact that you are trying to apply probabilistic reasoning in a way that doesn't account for the actual relationship between the two envelopes. The paradox suggests that switching envelopes always seems like the better choice, but if you continue reasoning this way, it leads to an infinite loop of switching, which is nonsensical. The mistake here is in the assumption that the probabilities of either envelope containing twice or half the amount are independent of each other. In reality, the two envelopes are linked. The amount in one envelope directly affects the amount in the other. When you reason about the expected value of switching, you're treating them as if they are separate, independent probabilities. But that's not the case. The paradox results from the flawed application of expected value to a situation where the two envelopes are interdependent. The problem of information. The two envelopes paradox reveals an important insight into decision-making under uncertainty. It shows that probabilistic reasoning alone cannot always lead to the right decision, especially when we don't have complete information. In the case of the envelopes, you're trying to make a decision based on partial knowledge. You know the amount in one envelope, but you have no idea how much is in the other. This lack of knowledge creates an illusion of certainty when reasoning about the best choice, leading to a paradoxical conclusion. The paradox also shows how imperfect information and flawed reasoning can lead us to contradictory decisions. If we were able to know the relationship between the two envelopes more clearly, the paradox would not arise. But because we lack full knowledge of the situation, our reasoning about expected value is flawed, and this leads us to a conclusion that seems illogical when applied in practice. Decision theory and the paradox. From the standpoint of decision theory, the two envelopes paradox challenges the way we think about expected utility. Expected utility theory involves calculating the average value of different possible outcomes to determine the best course of action. But in this case, the paradox shows that applying expected utility theory can lead to contradictory and illogical conclusions when the assumptions of the theory don't hold. The paradox suggests that probabilistic reasoning should be applied more carefully in situations where information is incomplete or uncertain. The fact that switching appears to increase the expected value indefinitely highlights a flaw in the way we apply expected value calculations to this type of problem. In reality, the expected value of switching doesn't actually exceed the value of sticking with your initial choice, but because we're basing our calculations on the wrong assumptions, it appears that switching is always the best option. This paradox emphasizes that in situations of uncertainty, decision-making is more complex than simply applying probabilistic reasoning. It forces us to reconsider how we calculate expected value and to recognize that real-world constraints can lead to different conclusions than theoretical calculations suggest. The resolution to the paradox. The key to resolving the two envelopes paradox lies in recognizing that the reasoning behind the expected value calculation is flawed due to the interdependence of the amounts in the two envelopes. The paradox occurs because we assume that switching will always give us a better expected value, but this assumption is incorrect when the envelopes are linked. By acknowledging that the expected value calculation doesn't account for the interdependence between the two envelopes, we can see that there is no reason to believe that switching envelopes will always increase the expected value. The paradox is resolved by recognizing that expected value cannot be calculated in isolation, and a more careful analysis of the relationship between the two envelopes is needed. Another approach to resolving the paradox is to recognize that infinite loops of reasoning based on expected value are not meaningful in real-world decision-making. The calculation of expected value is useful, but only when applied to situations where the assumptions about independence and probability hold true. In cases like the two envelopes paradox, where these assumptions are violated, the paradox highlights the limitations of probabilistic reasoning in making rational decisions. Conclusion: the limits of decision-making under uncertainty. The two envelopes. Paradox is a striking example of how probabilistic reasoning can lead to paradoxical conclusions when applied to situations involving uncertainty and incomplete information. It shows that expected value theory can sometimes lead us astray, especially when we don't fully understand the relationships between the elements of a decision-making problem. The paradox highlights the importance of carefully considering the assumptions behind our reasoning and recognizing that real-world constraints can prevent theoretical calculations from leading to sensible conclusions. In the end, the two envelopes paradox serves as a reminder of the limitations of mathematical reasoning and decision theory in the face of uncertainty. It forces us to think more critically about how we apply theory to practice and how we should approach decisions when full information is not available. By understanding the limits of probabilistic reasoning, we can avoid falling into logical traps like the one demonstrated in the paradox. The Barber Paradox, self-reference and set theory. The Barber Paradox is a famous puzzle in set theory and logic, particularly dealing with self-reference. The paradox was introduced by Bertrand Russell as a way to demonstrate certain problems with self-referential sets. The paradox goes like this. Imagine a barber who is known for a peculiar rule. He shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. The paradox then arises when we ask, does the barber shave himself? If the barber does shave himself, then according to the rule, he must not shave himself because he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then according to the rule, he must shave himself because he shaves all those who do not shave themselves. This creates a contradiction because the barber cannot logically either shave himself or not shave himself without violating the rule. The paradox forces us to confront the issue of self-reference and logical consistency, and it shows how set theory can lead to logical contradictions when self-reference is involved. The paradox explained. The Barber Paradox hinges on the notion of self-reference and the rules for defining sets. In this case, the barber is part of a set of men who are either shaved by themselves or shaved by the barber. The paradox arises when we try to place the barber into this set. If the barber shaves himself, he falls into the set of people who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, he falls into the set of people who are shaved by the barber. This situation is a logical loop. If the barber shaves himself, he must not shave himself, and if he does not shave himself, he must shave himself. This contradiction shows that the rules for the barber's shaving practices cannot be consistently applied to the barber himself. This paradox is a simplified version of a larger problem in set theory, which is known as Russell's paradox. Russell's paradox arose when considering a set that contains all sets that are not members of themselves, and the paradox is very similar to the Barber Paradox in that it involves a set that cannot consistently be defined. The paradox of self-reference. The Barber Paradox is primarily a problem of self-reference. The paradox occurs because the rule about who the barber shaves only those who do not shave themselves, leads to a contradiction when applied to the barber himself. This paradox is a classic example of how self-referential statements can lead to logical contradictions. Self-referential problems like the Barber Paradox reveal the difficulties in defining certain kinds of sets or categories in a way that does not lead to paradoxes. Russell used the Barber Paradox as a simplified example to highlight the issues with sets that reference themselves and the contradictions that can arise from such references. This paradox is closely related to other self-referential paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, in which a sentence refers to itself in a way that creates a logical contradiction. Both paradoxes reveal the complexities and limitations of reasoning when self-reference is involved. The resolution to the paradox. One way to resolve the Barber Paradox is to recognize that the barber, as described, cannot be part of the set of people who shave only those who do not shave themselves. This paradox is a contradiction that arises when trying to apply the rule to the barber, showing that no consistent set can be defined with the condition that the barber shaves only those who do not shave themselves. In set theory, this paradox led to the development of Russell's theory of types, which avoids such paradoxes by restricting how sets can be defined and preventing self-referencing sets from being constructed. According to this theory, objects, in this case men who are shaved, must be placed into different levels or types. A set that refers to itself cannot exist at the same level as the sets it contains, which avoids the paradox. In simpler terms, the resolution to the Barber Paradox is that no such barber can exist. The rule about who the barber shaves is inherently contradictory, and attempting to apply it leads to an impossible situation. The paradox illustrates the importance of defining consistent sets and avoiding self-reference in logical and mathematical systems. The significance of the paradox. The Barber Paradox has far-reaching implications in logic, set theory, and mathematics. It illustrates a fundamental problem with self-referential definitions and shows how paradoxes can arise when we try to define sets in an all-encompassing way. It also highlights the need for careful definitions and restrictions in logical systems to avoid contradictions. Russell's paradox, which emerged from similar concerns, was a critical turning point in the development of modern logic. It led to significant reforms in the foundations of mathematics, particularly in the development of type theory, which restricts the kinds of sets that can be defined to avoid such contradictions. Moreover, the Barber Paradox serves as a powerful tool in philosophy and epistemology to explore the limitations of language and conceptualization. It challenges our ability to make consistent statements about the world, especially when those statements involve self-reference. The paradox reminds us that our logical systems must be carefully constructed to avoid contradictions and ensure consistency. Conclusion: the limits of self-reference and set theory. The Barber Paradox is an insightful and elegant example of how self-reference and set theory can lead to logical contradictions. By illustrating the impossibility of defining a set that contains elements which refer to themselves, the paradox highlights the challenges of defining and categorizing objects in a logically consistent way. It shows that paradoxes arise when self-referential sets are allowed, and it points to the need for careful restrictions in logical systems to maintain consistency. Russell's paradox and the Barber Paradox both reveal the deep complexities and potential pitfalls of self-reference in logic and mathematics. These paradoxes are foundational in the development of modern logic and continue to shape our understanding of how we define and reason about the world. The Lottery Paradox: belief, evidence, and rationality. The Lottery Paradox is a thought experiment in epistemology that raises important questions about belief, evidence, and rationality. The paradox deals with the tension between individual belief in a proposition and the overall probability of that proposition being true. The paradox can be illustrated through the example of a lottery. Imagine you're participating in a lottery where there are 1,000 tickets, but only one winning ticket. Before the drawing, you know that the probability of any particular ticket winning is 1 in 1,000. Now, as you are holding your ticket, you might still believe that your ticket will not win because you understand that the odds are heavily against you. But here's the paradox. While you have a rational belief that your own ticket won't win, you simultaneously know that one ticket must win. Even though the probability of any specific ticket winning is extremely low, it is certain that exactly one ticket will win. This creates a paradox because you are rationally justified in believing that your ticket will not win, yet you are also rationally justified in believing that one ticket will win, and therefore there must be a winner among the 1,000 tickets. This creates a tension between individual beliefs that your ticket won't win and the overall certainty that one ticket must win. If you believe that your ticket won't win, then you are rejecting the belief that your ticket could win, even though one of the tickets will definitely win. The paradox forces us to think about how we should form beliefs when dealing with probability and certainty. The paradox explained. The lottery paradox arises from the fact that, although the probability of a specific ticket winning is very low, there is certainty that one of the tickets will win. You, as a rational individual, might think that your ticket has a very low chance of winning, but that belief doesn't align neatly with the fact that one ticket will certainly win. Here's the problem. Suppose you hold your ticket and know that the chances of winning are 1 in 1,000. In this case, it seems perfectly reasonable for you to believe that your ticket won't win. However, because the lottery has a winner, you know that one ticket will indeed win. This seems to create an inconsistency in your beliefs. You have good reasons to believe that your ticket won't win, but you also know, on a larger level, that one ticket will win. It's a paradox because on one hand, you believe that your ticket won't win, but on the other, you know that someone must win, so you are implicitly doubting that your ticket is not the winning one. Yet, if you extend this reasoning to all of the other tickets, you will find that each ticket holder can similarly believe that their ticket won't win, despite the certainty that one ticket will. The problem of rational belief. The lottery paradox raises important issues about the nature of rational belief and how evidence works in uncertain situations. When we deal with probabilities, we often have to balance the likelihood of an event with the certainty of other broader truths. For example, you might be confident that your ticket won't win, but at the same time, you know that one ticket will win. The paradox challenges our understanding of how we form beliefs in these kinds of situations. If all tickets have the same odds of winning, why do we still believe that our own ticket won't win, even though we know one of the tickets will? The paradox illustrates a challenge in epistemology. When does belief become irrational? In a lottery, believing that your ticket won't win is rational because the probability is low, but the paradox suggests that it's possible to have contradictory beliefs. We accept that our ticket won't win, but we also accept that one ticket must win, even though those beliefs seem to be in conflict. The question arises, can we hold conflicting rational beliefs? On the one hand, it is reasonable to believe that your ticket won't win, given the extremely low probability. On the other hand, it's also true that one ticket must win. So how do we reconcile these beliefs? Do we have to reject one of these beliefs to avoid irrationality? Probability and certainty. The lottery paradox highlights the difference between probability and certainty. In everyday life, we often make decisions based on probabilities. If the odds of an event are very low, we might act as though the event is unlikely to happen. For example, we may believe that it's unlikely for our ticket to win because the odds are so slim. However, the paradox shows that this kind of reasoning becomes problematic when we know that one ticket will definitely win. When we are dealing with a situation in which one outcome is certain, like the fact that one ticket will win, but we have a probability distribution that suggests most tickets won't win, how do we manage our beliefs about the probability of individual events in light of the certainty of the overall outcome? One possible resolution to the paradox is that beliefs about probabilities are based on the underlying reasoning we use to evaluate the odds of specific events. In the case of the lottery, it's rational to believe that your ticket won't win because the probability is so low. But the certainty that one ticket will win doesn't force you to change your belief about the low probability for your ticket, as long as you are considering the overall structure of the lottery. The lottery paradox and self-consistency. The paradox also touches on the problem of self-consistency in beliefs. If it is rational to believe that your ticket won't win, then how do we reconcile that belief with the certainty that one ticket must win? One resolution to this issue is to argue that belief formation often involves prioritizing certain facts over others. In this case, the belief that your ticket won't win might be based on the low probability of winning, which can be held with high confidence. The certainty that one ticket will win, on the other hand, doesn't require that we change our individual belief, because it applies to the general structure of the lottery, not the individual ticket. Another possible resolution is to acknowledge that individual probabilities and overall outcomes can be rationally considered separately. In the case of the lottery, each ticket has a low chance of winning, and it is rational to act as though your ticket won't win. But the fact that one ticket will definitely win is a separate issue, one that pertains to the overall system of the lottery rather than any specific ticket. In this way, we can hold both the low probability of winning for our own ticket and the certainty of one winning ticket without feeling the need to reconcile the two beliefs directly. Conclusion: belief, probability, and certainty. The lottery paradox forces us to think more deeply about how we form rational beliefs when dealing with uncertainty and probability. It challenges our understanding of evidence and how we manage beliefs about individual outcomes, while knowing that there are broader certain outcomes in a system. The paradox reveals that rational beliefs can coexist even when they appear contradictory, as long as they are based on different aspects of the situation. This paradox highlights the tension between probability and certainty in decision-making. While it's rational to believe that your lottery ticket won't win due to the low probability, the overall certainty that one ticket will win doesn't force you to abandon that belief. The paradox asks us to consider how beliefs about the individual and the collective can be reconciled when they seem to be at odds. Ultimately, the lottery paradox invites us to rethink the nature of rational belief, the role of probability, and the implications of certainty in our reasoning. The paradox of the preface, knowledge and self-contradiction. The paradox of the preface is a problem in epistemology, the study of knowledge, that challenges our understanding of belief, certainty, and rationality. It arises from the observation that, while we can hold many beliefs that seem to make sense individually, we may also simultaneously hold beliefs that contradict each other, even when we are aware of this contradiction. The paradox is often framed in the context of books and writing, especially the preface of a book. Imagine an author writing a book in which they claim, "I believe all of the facts presented in this book are true." At the same time, in the preface of the book, the author might write, "Although I believe every fact presented in this book is true, I acknowledge that there might be some minor errors." This presents a paradox. How can the author believe that every fact in the book is true, while also acknowledging that there could be errors? At first, these two statements seem contradictory. If the author believes all the facts are true, then they should not accept the possibility of errors in the book. But if they acknowledge the possibility of errors, it implies that they don't fully believe that everything in the book is true. This creates a conflict between the author's belief in the truth of the book's contents and their recognition of potential errors. The paradox of the preface challenges the idea that it's possible to hold fully consistent beliefs about all of our knowledge, especially when acknowledging our fallibility. The central issue in the paradox is the nature of rational belief and self-knowledge. How can a person be rationally justified in believing that every fact in a book is true, while simultaneously acknowledging the possibility that some of those facts might be wrong? The paradox forces us to reconsider how we handle uncertainty in our beliefs, and whether it is rational to accept the possibility of error while maintaining confidence in the overall truth of our knowledge. To understand the paradox more clearly, we can imagine the situation in the following way. An author writes a book and believes that every fact presented is true. The author has a strong belief in the accuracy of their work. However, the author also admits in the preface that errors are possible, even though they do not know of any specific errors in the book. The paradox arises because the author, by acknowledging the possibility of errors, is saying that they do not believe with absolute certainty that the book is free from mistakes. But if they truly believed that every fact in the book is true, there would be no room for any error. This creates a contradiction. The author recognizes that, despite their high confidence in the truth of the book, they are still willing to admit that mistakes could exist. This opens up questions about the nature of confidence in our knowledge and how we can be justified in believing something to be true while acknowledging the possibility of error. The paradox also makes us reflect on whether it is possible to be completely consistent in our beliefs, or whether we can still be rational while acknowledging our fallibility. One possible way to resolve this paradox is to argue that certainty is not always required for rational belief. In other words, it is possible to believe something to be true while acknowledging the possibility of error, as long as that belief is held with a high degree of confidence. According to this view, the author's belief in the truth of the book's content can coexist with their recognition of the possibility of mistakes, as long as the belief in the accuracy of the work is strong enough to guide their actions and decisions. This resolution treats knowledge as a gradual spectrum, rather than a collection of absolute truths. The fact that we cannot be absolutely certain about everything does not necessarily invalidate the beliefs we hold with high confidence. Another approach to solving the paradox is to argue that the preface itself is an expression of pragmatic reasoning. In this view, the author's belief in the truth of the book's content is seen as practically certain, even if it is not logically perfect. The preface could then be interpreted as a practical humility rather than a literal admission of error. The author may be acknowledging the limits of their knowledge, but they are still confident enough in the overall truth of their book to proceed with publishing it. In this sense, the paradox does not arise because of a logical contradiction, but rather from the human tendency to be aware of the potential for error without letting that awareness undermine their overall confidence in their beliefs. The paradox of the preface is significant because it raises important questions about knowledge and belief. It forces us to consider how we balance certainty and uncertainty when forming our beliefs. The paradox also challenges the idea that rational belief is simply about holding perfectly consistent beliefs. Instead, it suggests that rationality involves accepting the possibility of being wrong, even while maintaining confidence in the overall truth of our beliefs. It asks whether we can hold beliefs with high confidence while simultaneously acknowledging our fallibility. Ultimately, the paradox of the preface highlights the complexity of epistemic justification, the process of determining whether a belief is justified. It forces us to ask what counts as rational belief and whether our awareness of the limitations of our knowledge is an essential part of being rational. In a world where certainty is often elusive and knowledge is always subject to revision, the paradox reminds us that rational belief is not about holding flawless and error-free beliefs, but about recognizing the limits of our knowledge while still acting on what we believe to be true. The paradox of the ravens. How does evidence relate to generalizations? The paradox of the ravens, also known as Hempel's paradox, is a problem that arises in the realm of confirmation theory and challenges our understanding of how evidence supports generalizations. The paradox explores how specific observations can be used to confirm or disconfirm a general statement. The paradox was first introduced by the philosopher Carl Hempel in the 1940s, and it forces us to think more critically about how evidence works in the process of scientific reasoning. The paradox can be framed with a simple generalization: all ravens are black. This is a hypothesis or general statement that we might want to confirm. The paradox asks, what counts as evidence that would confirm or disconfirm this generalization? If we observe a black raven, it seems intuitive to say that this provides evidence in favor of the statement, all ravens are black. But does the observation of a white sock, for example, also provide evidence for the same hypothesis? The paradox arises from the seemingly counterintuitive fact that any observation of a non-black object that is not a raven, such as a white sock, would, in principle, provide evidence for the general statement, all ravens are black, because it is consistent with the statement that all ravens are black. This creates an odd situation where evidence that seems unrelated to ravens at all still counts toward confirming the hypothesis. This paradox challenges our intuitive understanding of evidence and raises important questions about how we gather and interpret information in the process of forming beliefs or scientific conclusions. The paradox explained. To break down the paradox of the ravens, let's start with the general statement, all ravens are black. This is a universal generalization that we can test by observing ravens. If we observe a raven and it is black, we seem to have gathered evidence that supports the statement. This makes sense. A black raven aligns with the claim that all ravens are black. Now here comes the paradox. What happens if we observe something that is not a raven, like a white sock? According to the rules of logic, the observation of a non-black raven, that is, something that isn't a raven at all, should also provide evidence in support of the statement, all ravens are black. After all, the white sock is consistent with the statement because it is not a raven, and thus does not contradict the claim that all ravens are black. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. How could the observation of a white sock or a red car be considered evidence that confirms the statement, all ravens are black? It doesn't seem to relate to the hypothesis directly, but if we think in terms of logical consistency, any evidence that does not contradict the hypothesis, even observations that have nothing to do with ravens at all, will still technically support the hypothesis. In this way, the paradox highlights a strange feature of scientific reasoning. It suggests that evidence for a hypothesis might come from seemingly irrelevant or unrelated observations, simply because those observations do not contradict the hypothesis. The role of confirmation and evidence. To better understand the paradox, we need to examine the role of confirmation in scientific reasoning. The problem of how evidence supports or confirms a generalization is central to how scientific theories are tested. Ideally, we want evidence to confirm a theory or hypothesis directly and meaningfully, but the paradox of the ravens forces us to question whether we're truly gathering evidence in a way that is intuitive or reasonable. In scientific reasoning, confirmation theory tries to answer the question of how we can use observations or data to confirm hypotheses. The paradox reveals that the process of confirmation might not be as straightforward as we'd like. Observations of unrelated events can technically contribute to confirming a hypothesis if they do not contradict it. But this leads to the question of whether such evidence really counts in a meaningful way. Does seeing a white sock really provide evidence for the hypothesis, all ravens are black? Most people would intuitively say no, yet the paradox suggests that from a purely logical standpoint, it does. This issue is particularly important in the philosophy of science because it pushes us to reconsider how we gather evidence and build theories. Are we mistakenly accepting irrelevant evidence as meaningful, or is there a deeper connection between seemingly unrelated observations and the broader theory we're testing? The paradox suggests that confirmation of a hypothesis is not always as simple as observing things that directly support it. The paradox and the problem of induction. The paradox of the ravens is also related to the problem of induction, which is a long-standing issue in the philosophy of science. Induction is the process of drawing general conclusions from specific observations. For example, after observing many black ravens, we might conclude that all ravens are black. But the problem with induction is that no number of observations of black ravens can logically guarantee that all ravens are black, because there might be a raven somewhere that is not black. In the same way, observing a white sock doesn't provide meaningful evidence to confirm the hypothesis, but it still seems to logically contribute to the confirmation of the generalization. This paradox highlights the difficulty of inductive reasoning, the process by which we generalize from a limited number of observations. Inductive reasoning involves drawing conclusions from patterns or trends, but it relies on the assumption that the future will resemble the past. The problem is that this assumption is not always valid. The paradox shows that even seemingly irrelevant or unrelated observations can contribute to our belief in a theory, but that doesn't mean those observations provide strong or meaningful confirmation. The paradox and hypothesis testing. Another important aspect of the paradox of the ravens is its relationship to hypothesis testing. In science, testing hypotheses involves gathering evidence that either supports or contradicts a claim. For example, in testing the hypothesis, all ravens are black, we would ideally want to find black ravens as evidence. But the paradox suggests that even if we observe something unrelated, like a white sock, that observation can still technically support the hypothesis. This raises questions about the reliability of the evidence we use in testing hypotheses. It challenges the idea that only directly relevant evidence should count as confirmation. In the case of the raven's paradox, the observation of a non-black object that is not a raven doesn't directly confirm the hypothesis, but it doesn't contradict it either. It highlights the tension between logical consistency and meaningful confirmation. Philosophical implications of the paradox. The paradox of the ravens forces us to reflect on the nature of evidence in the process of scientific reasoning. It suggests that confirmation theory and the process of inductively confirming hypotheses may not be as straightforward as it seems. This paradox has important implications for how we understand the process of theory testing in science. Should we be more selective about the kinds of evidence we accept as confirmation? Or is any evidence that doesn't contradict a hypothesis, no matter how tangential, acceptable for confirming that hypothesis? This paradox also plays into broader questions about the role of evidence in knowledge acquisition and scientific discovery. It reveals that evidence can be both counterintuitive and subject to interpretation, challenging our conventional understanding of how we validate knowledge and build theories. Conclusion: the limits of inductive reasoning. The paradox of the ravens reveals the complexities and paradoxes of induction. It forces us to reconsider the ways in which evidence is used to support generalizations and to ask whether seemingly irrelevant observations really count as confirmation of a hypothesis. The paradox demonstrates that evidence in support of a hypothesis may not always come from directly related observations, but that doesn't necessarily make those observations meaningful or reliable. It invites us to think more deeply about how we collect evidence, what counts as meaningful evidence, and how we arrive at conclusions in scientific reasoning. The Omnipotence Paradox. Can an omnipotent being be contradicted? The Omnipotence Paradox is a classic philosophical problem that questions the nature and limits of omnipotence, particularly in relation to the concept of an all-powerful being, such as God. The paradox typically takes the form of a question. Can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that even they cannot lift it? This seemingly simple question presents a profound challenge to our understanding of power, possibility, and logical consistency. At the heart of the paradox is a logical contradiction that arises when we try to define omnipotence. If an omnipotent being can do anything, it seems that the answer to the paradox should be yes. The being should be able to create a rock that even it cannot lift. But this would imply a limitation on the being's power, since the being would not be able to lift the rock it created. On the other hand, if the being cannot create such a rock, then it seems that there is something it cannot do, which also appears to challenge the idea of omnipotence. The Omnipotence Paradox highlights the difficulty of understanding infinite power and how it interacts with logical consistency. Can true omnipotence exist without contradiction? Or is the concept of omnipotence itself inherently flawed because it cannot be logically defined? To understand the paradox more deeply, let's break down the question. Can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that even it cannot lift it? If the being can create such a rock, then the being would be unable to lift it. But if the being cannot lift it, it suggests that the being is not omnipotent because there is something that it cannot do. This creates a contradiction, as the definition of omnipotence implies that there should be no limits to what the being can do. If the being cannot create such a rock, then it seems that there is something the being cannot do, which again appears to contradict the notion of omnipotence. If an omnipotent being is defined as being able to do anything, then the inability to create this rock would suggest that the being has limitations. Both scenarios lead to a paradox. The idea of an omnipotent being seems to contradict itself, as either the being's power is limited, if it can't lift the rock, or its power is not logically coherent, if it can create a rock that it can't lift. One of the core issues that the Omnipotence Paradox raises is the relationship between omnipotence and logical consistency. Omnipotence is often understood as the ability to do anything without any limitations. But does this mean that an omnipotent being can do things that are logically incoherent, such as creating contradictions or performing impossible actions? For example, many philosophers argue that omnipotence does not necessarily include the power to do logically contradictory things. In other words, an omnipotent being could do anything that is possible, but it cannot do something that is impossible by definition. For instance, it would not be possible for an omnipotent being to create a square circle, because the concept of a square circle is a logical contradiction. It is not something that could exist in any possible world. In this sense, the power to do the impossible might not be included in the definition of omnipotence. This view suggests that omnipotence does not entail the ability to do logical impossibilities, like creating a rock that cannot be lifted, because these are not genuine tasks, they are just self-contradictions. An omnipotent being can do anything that is logically possible, but it cannot perform logically absurd actions. Another possible solution is to understand omnipotence as the ability to do all things that are within the nature of power. This approach holds that power is a meaningful concept only when it is applied to possible tasks. To create a logically impossible situation, such as a rock too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift, is not a task that can be done because it is beyond the reach of power itself. Some philosophers also argue that omniscience, the knowledge of all things, and omnipotence, the power to do all things, are interrelated. An omnipotent being would not only have the power to do everything that is logically possible, but also the knowledge to understand the limits of that power. According to this view, omnipotence does not lead to contradictions because an omnipotent being would recognize that certain actions, like creating a rock it cannot lift, are meaningless. The Omnipotence Paradox also intersects with discussions about free will. If an omnipotent being can do anything, then can it choose to limit its own power? Or does omnipotence necessitate the ability to do everything, even actions that contradict itself? This raises questions about whether an omnipotent being would have free will. Can a being with absolute power still make choices that are genuinely free? Or is the concept of free will meaningless in the face of absolute omnipotence? For example, if an omnipotent being can choose to do anything, does that mean it has the freedom to choose not to act omnipotently? Can an omnipotent being willfully limit its own power? This question delves into the broader philosophical debate about the nature of freedom and determination in the context of an all-powerful being. The Omnipotence Paradox challenges us to think more carefully about the nature of power, possibility, and logical consistency. It asks whether omnipotence truly means the ability to do anything, or whether it is better understood as the ability to do everything that is logically possible. The paradox suggests that logical consistency must be a part of omnipotence, and that an omnipotent being cannot be expected to perform logically impossible actions. The paradox also forces us to reconsider the concept of power and the nature of the infinite. It shows that even the idea of an all-powerful being raises deep and unresolved questions about the limits of logic and possibility. The Omnipotence Paradox serves as a profound reminder of the limits of human understanding when it comes to concepts like power, freedom, and the infinite.